Great pleasure to welcome Wayne Scheggia. Wayne is the Deputy CEO of the Western Australian Local Government Association. WALGA has been fighting a Western Australian government proposal to impose rate capping in the West, and is here today to share the Western Australian experience with us and WALGA's assessment of the concept. Welcome, Wayne.
Thanks, President. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and their elders past and present, together with LGA President, Mayor Dave Burgess, and the LGA board members who might be here this morning, Commonwealth and federal MPs. I mean, it's great to see that you've got federal member Matt here today, you've got your local government minister, you've got your opposition spokesperson for local government here. Can I say, regardless of views or politics that any of those individuals might have, you have to give them respect for being here and being willing to participate in your conversation. I know that's something we value in Western Australia, and it's great to see that you've got that access, at least here, so thank you to them. And can I say to Matt, great to see you acknowledge the GST scenario in Western Australia. As a Western Australian taxpayer, I'm happy to subsidise everybody to be here today. And of course, I also want to acknowledge other dignitaries in the room, other speakers, and all of you as leaders in the sector. My aim today is to tell you a little bit about my organisation and how we go about our business, make some provocative statements about rate capping that you can all furiously agree with, talk about what rate capping is and isn't good for, and help you think about what you might do about it. And of course, always acknowledging that I'll be talking in the context of Western Australia, so you need to be discerning when you listen to me and take from it what you think is relevant, and be sure to be critical of those comments in your own context. Well, it's not dissimilar from the LGASA. We represent all the local governments in the state. We seek to influence the government's legislative program to the advantage of the sector. We provide a range of capacity building services and programs that enhance the capability of local governments to do their job. In doing this, we have a philosophy that was perhaps best enunciated by French intellectual Voltaire in the mid-1700s. And he said, governments need both shepherds and butchers. That's it. It's the only slide I've got. This will not be death by PowerPoint. And I want to leave that up there, and I want you to reflect on that all the way through the conversation this morning. What this means for us, in the most part, is that we try and work with the political powers that exist, helping to guide, influence and shape their policies and their decisions. And when you think about the fact that in Western Australia there's 139 local governments, there's 1,400 elected members, there's about 12,500 employees in the workforce, and we're spending close to 15% equivalent of the state's budget, that's a pretty powerful and useful partner to have in delivering outcomes for the state. You also would ask the question, why would you want to make an enemy of that? However, when our cooperative approach fails and we can't get reason from political decision makers, we move to create consequences that help correct the imbalance in the force. Rate capping is an imbalance in the force. Rate capping is populism, not best practice. Rate capping is a discussion that occurs regularly in local and statewide newspapers, most often at the start of a new financial year, as those in need of a headline start to speculate about how outrageous the cost of local government will be in the year ahead. Rate capping is the echoing rhetoric of some state premiers and their treasurers looking for diversions from their own poor financial performance as they deliver debt-laden state budgets to parliaments that are trying desperately to hold them accountable for the cost of living in the suburbs and hamlets of the nation. Rate capping is the punitive posturing of tired state politicians who rise on the promise of change and fall on their inability to have a single creative thought during their term of office. Rate capping has no political colour or geography. In WA, it's been threatened by the Conservatives, and it was Labor Party policy at the last state election. In New South Wales, governments of all political persuasions have applied rate capping to local government. It was imposed in Victoria last year, and is a live political debate here in South Australia and in Tasmania. Rate capping is not a new idea. According to University of New England Professor Brian Dollery, the genesis of modern-day rate capping lies in the 1976 New South Wales state election campaign, where rapidly increasing rates had become a subject of political controversy, prompting the then leader of the ALP, Neville Rand, to encourage the party to adopt rate capping as policy. Now, we need to be conscious of the link between political opportunity and the volume of the debate around rate capping, and this shouldn't be taken lightly by local government. Over the period 1973 to 1976, and let's remember they were tumultuous years in anybody's measure at all levels of government, New South Wales local government rates had increased by an average of 188%, whereas average weekly earnings over the same period rose by 75%, and the cumulative inflation rate for those years was 56%. Headlines like that are never going to produce good outcomes for local governments. That's why I say we have to be cognizant of where we are in the political spectrum. In perhaps a slightly more contemporary 1990s context, then Victorian incoming Premier Jeff Kennett introduced a rate cap as part of a broad package of local government reforms when he came to power. Kennett's freeze on local government rating was prompted as an important driver for the other elements of his reform package. Things like compulsory competitive tendering, contracting out of service delivery. So arguably, it wasn't about populist politics, and I try to say that seriously. Make no mistake, rate capping is bad. External restrictions on local government revenue raising and its capacity to raise rates can lead to chronic under-expenditure on core services, and particularly on asset management, maintenance and renewal. I don't make that up. Evidence from New South Wales, where it's been in place since the mid-70s, demonstrates rate capping can adversely affect sound financial management, lead to a significant infrastructure backlog, and it will jeopardise long-term financial sustainability of local governments. Over the 15 years from 1999 to 2014, if New South Wales local governments had been able to rate in a similar manner to local governments in all the other states, they would have collectively raised additional revenue of around about $14.3 billion. By not doing so, there's been an effective underspend on infrastructure renewal in the order of between $400 and $600 million per annum in New South Wales. Today, it would cost $6.3 billion of upfront investment to return that infrastructure to satisfactory condition. New South Wales Treasury Corp's review, not local government's review, the Treasury Corporation's review of local government's financial sustainability in 2012 found that most local governments reported unsustainable operating deficits. Their financial sustainability was at risk and was deteriorating, and there was a significant infrastructure backlog and asset maintenance gap. In 2013, the New South Wales Independent Panel of Local Government Review found that rate capping had led to significant under-expenditure on infrastructure maintenance and renewal, leading to a mounting infrastructure backlog. Furthermore, that panel concluded the rate pegging system in its present form impacts adversely on sound financial management. It creates unwarranted political difficulties for councils that really can and should raise rates above the peg to meet genuine expenditure needs and ensure their long-term sustainability. The panel can find no evidence from experience in other states to suggest that councils would subject their ratepayers to grossly excessive or unreasonable imposts if rate pegging were relaxed. Because that is one of the myths that goes with the debate about local government rates, is that you're all out there gouging the electorate, gouging ratepayers for some sort of extravagant expenditure program that would be unreasonable in anybody else's eyes. The evidence says that's not true. Additional recent research sponsored by WALGA shows that the collective rating effort of local governments in all other jurisdictions outside of New South Wales is remarkably similar. It's consistent, and that strongly suggests that the absence of rate capping doesn't result in wholesale revenue gouging by local governments. In WA, our experience feels a lot like 1970s New South Wales rather than 1990s Victoria. There's been a spike recently in the media profile of local government rates, and that's beyond what we would expect in the normal cycle of events. This has been fed by impromptu comments from our Premier and the Minister for Local Government on occasion, which are none too subtle attacks on the sector. These come on the back of an embarrassing failure by the government to achieve any meaningful structural reform in WA, despite pushing an amalgamation agenda for the last 7 years. And I might add, that's an agenda that our association has been collaborating and cooperating with government to explore. This is not an agenda that has been enduring significant attack from the association, from the sector in general. That realisation casts the rate capping debate in an interesting context, one of vindictive punishment as opposed to reform initiative. Rate capping's never been part of the so-called reform agenda in Western Australia during this time. In fact, the government's reform conversation has centred on the entry-level proposition that larger local governments will achieve greater economies of scale, and they've never really got beyond that concept. Our association, on the other hand, has long been concerned about the general sustainability of local governments. And I say general sustainability because sustainability is not just a financial conversation. It's a policy setting around community, society and the environment, as well as the economics of the situation. How to improve the capacity of local governments to become more reliant on their own source of revenues as part of that general sustainability debate has been our agenda. Once local communities took our state government to task over their amalgamation proposals through a series of formal community polls that rejected the government's direction, we think there's been a very organised and specific program or campaign that's emerging, which is highly critical of local governments and is fostering a perception that the state must intervene. In addition to floating the rate capping concept, things like justifying moves to place local government audits in the hands of the Auditor General as opposed to the Department of Local Government have been supported by non-specific criticisms of local government's financial management. Moves to impose mandatory training on elected members amid criticisms of the standard, quality and conduct of elected members has peaked during the recent, and I say recent meaning October 2015, local government elections. There's been thinly veiled implications of sector-wide corruption following the release of a CCC report which said that local government, and I quote, was at risk of corruption based on the fact that the CCC had received 600 accusations against local governments. Now, accusations, of course, aren't proven cases. Accusations are just somebody making a statement that then has to be investigated, validated and executed. At the same time, about 13,000 accusations were made against state agencies, but apparently they're okay and no action's necessary. Accusations of inefficiency, particularly around the processing of development approvals, have been made, and are being used to justify moves to introduce a program that's called Instant Start, which will allow builders to commence works without a building approval from their local authority. Can you imagine what sort of chaos could rain down in your communities if you had builders out there progressing the construction of developments before you'd issued a building approval, before you had looked at the conditions which must apply, before you'd been able to validate that what was going ahead was appropriate? It's outrageous, it's ridiculous. That program is currently on hold because of protests from us in the sector, but it hasn't gone away. WALGA's adopted position is to oppose the introduction of rate capping and to campaign against any attempt to introduce it in the future. That's clear. In order to give effect to this position, our State Council has also resolved that as a matter of urgency, considering the issues of potential constraints to local government revenue sources, which include rate capping, cost shifting, restrictions on fees and charges, the highest priority be given to urgently developing a hard-hitting strategy and campaign prior to the next state government election. The headline act of our campaign will be about $300,000 of television advertising. This won't be trying to explain the complexities of local government finance or the vagaries of the rating system. If you think you can convince the electorate about the detailed construction of local government rates in a 30-second television campaign, you need to think again. Rather, we'll be highlighting the poor financial and strategic record of the state with the clear message that communities don't want the Premier and the Treasurer of any political persuasion interfering with the decisions of the community at the local level. The backbone of our campaign, however, will necessarily be at the community level. Whilst we can make a splash in the big media, the success of a campaign lies in the capacity of the local governments to engage their communities in the debate and create the threat and understanding of consequences at the electoral level. In the lead up to a state election, we think the backbench will be very keen for the government to be seen to be reconciling with the community rather than interfering in local decision making. WALGA is currently working with the political parties to obtain policy commitments to oppose rate capping in the lead up to the 2017 state election. At the moment, we've got, and I need to put this on the record, a commitment from the local government minister himself following a meeting and a discussion that I had with him in one of our regions a fortnight ago, that he will not be pursuing rate capping in Western Australia. And that was pleasing. Our response to him was, and we'd like to hear that from the Premier. And he nodded his head. Part of the difficulty with rate capping is that it's popular with an uninformed electorate, which is why, in our view, the debate needs to shift towards good financial management and away from cheaper taxes, because that's what rate capping is saying. Politicians win elections every day of the week on a platform of lower taxes, but they get voted out just as quickly if they can't manage the money that they've raised. Now, there's some stark contrast between the WA state government's rhetoric towards local government and its own performance. For a start, WA local government is a good financial manager. Unlike the debt and deficit-riddled state and Commonwealth governments, WA local governments have more funds invested than borrowed. The sector is a net lender. It wasn't WA local governments that lost our state's AAA credit rating. And in fact, one of the things we're currently exploring is the capacity to get credit ratings for our councils and the sector as a whole, because we're fairly confident they'll exceed that that's allocated to the state. Let's remember that local governments are accounting for more than just inflation in their rating decisions. They're costing their strategic plans. They're costing long-term asset management plans. They're developing long-term financial plans that will enable them to fund their strategic and infrastructure decisions. And I think, as one of the people asking questions earlier pointed out, they're also covering state and federal cost shifting and reduced income streams. Just for the record, our state government doesn't have a strategic plan or an infrastructure plan. It does have a budget with some projections for the out years, which it may or it may not fund. When it comes to cooperating with other governments, as they expect local governments to do, to develop things like economies of scale, which they're so enthusiastic about, when they're asked to cooperate on things like Infrastructure Australia, our Premier is quite proud of the fact that he won't be dictated to by Canberra. Now, that's not a particularly collegiate example to be setting for the sector, and it does reek of a double standard of sorts. There are also some serious impediments to local government's capacity to raise own source revenues through things like fees and charges. Many of these in WA are restricted to cost recovery, meaning local governments can't cross-subsidise their rates from an area which might have a capacity to pay. Now, you can argue about whether or not that's good financial management, and I don't think cross-subsidisation necessarily is, but the point is, it's not even an option. Worse than this, though, is the fact that many of these costs, recovery charges, are set by legislation or regulation controlled by the state. This means that the state must review them in order for them to change. If this doesn't happen annually, the sector is pushed into a situation where its fees and charges don't cover its operating costs. The costs of services delivery aren't met. That puts pressure back on rating. Now, for example, local government's planning fees haven't been reviewed for over 5 years. Charges under the DOG Act were not reviewed for nearly 10 years until recently. We've been calling for the state's Economic Regulation Authority to conduct an all-encompassing review of local government's fees and charges, to bring all of these up to date, and also to determine whether in fact local governments shouldn't be given the capacity to set their own fees and charges as they see fit. We've agreed to terms of reference with the ERA and the government, but so far that request for the ERA review to be actioned has been languishing in the Treasurer's in-tray for 18 months. 18 months. That's the time frame, and we still don't have a decision. Compare that to wanting to give builders the right to go and start business without even having a building approval issued by a council. 18 months for nothing so far. Even though the evidence is clear in our minds that local government is a better manager of financial resources than the other spheres of government, some state politicians want to promote the idea that they should decide how local governments determine their rating levels. Again, the evidence simply doesn't support that move, and a good example of why that's so can be found in the way in WA the states artificially impose pricing restrictions on public utilities. That's the mechanism that produced a 37% increase in electricity prices in the WA budget forecast as a result of having to play catch-up after years of artificially capping prices. At present, each local government is accountable to its local community for the quality of its financial management. That nexus becomes compromised if another sphere of government determines the rating level, and that diminishes the legitimacy of local government as a sphere of government. None of that, though, should be taken to mean that local governments can't do better, and we're the first ones to acknowledge that they can. Local government's common clarion claim of being closest to the people and accountable to the community is in many cases a cliche, and it isn't honoured always in a best practice way. We acknowledge that. I think the Kiwis have got a better handle on this issue than many of our domestic jurisdictions, and I'd recommend that state politicians, local governments, interested ratepayers have a look at what's happening in New Zealand, and particularly have a look at their financial reporting and prudence regulations. In 2012-13, the New Zealand government moved away from its rhetoric of rate capping and shifted to a platform of community accountability for rating performance. Financial reporting and prudence regulations were introduced in 2014 to tighten financial reporting, lift transparency, and encourage excellence in local government. An aim of those new regulations at the time was to foster a culture of continuous improvement across the sector and showcase best practice excellence in local authority management. Today, New Zealand councils must report against a set of benchmarks around key elements of financial prudence, things like affordability, sustainability and predictability. A council must include a disclosure statement in its long-term plan and annual report on those benchmarks. They're required to include statements comparing rates, rate increases, borrowings, returns on investment, with the limits and targets set in their financial strategy. They develop long-term rating strategies and report their actual rating outcomes against those planned rating levels in their annual reports. This makes them specifically accountable for their rating levels and means the public is fully informed of the planned and actual performance. So the public gets to judge and make a decision about the quality of that local government performance, not the state. The states recognise that its role is to put the system forward that allows the information to come out. Local governments operate within it and the community holds them accountable for it. The way forward for local government in this debate about rate capping would appear to hinge on a better appreciation by state governments that individual communities will be best served at the local level with local decision making that's transparent, accountable and responsible. This requires a focus on developing best practice planning, reporting and accountability frameworks, ensuring effective community engagement in those long-term plans, transparent and easily understood reporting on performance against predetermined benchmarks, and the community's capacity to readily compare performance of the council with others of a similar nature. Over time, state and federal governments have changed their funding offerings to local government, moving away from general purpose funding, which can be spent according to the specific needs of a local community, to specific purpose funding, which, as the name implies, must be spent specifically on the approved purposes. This means that local governments must find funding elsewhere to fill the widening operating gap. Taking away local governments' capacity to fill the gap by dictating limits on their rating capacity is virtually dictating that local governments adopt poor financial and asset management as policy. Lessons from states that have rate capping, like New South Wales, demonstrate that rate capping results in reductions in infrastructure asset maintenance as capital funds are shifted to cover operating expense shortfalls. Over time, asset maintenance problems become asset replacement problems, which leads to higher debt because local governments haven't had the financial capacity to create savings to fund asset replacement. They haven't been able to become net lenders instead of net borrowers. Under this scenario, local governments experience the same negative consequences of debt and deficits that are plaguing our state and federal governments. Is that what ratepayers and residents of our communities want? Local governments don't want people to pay higher rates than are necessary. Local governments don't want to charge higher rates than they need to. State governments should not dictate rating levels to local governments. Let the community hold all governments accountable for the decisions that those levels of governments respectively make. The more pressing issue, I think, is the need to review taxation at all levels of government and how it's distributed for the most public good. Let's get on with that debate. Let's get on to a more constructive and strategic approach to ensuring good financial management across all levels of government. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. There were some great words and some great ideas in there for all of us, I think. Wayne's happy to take a couple of questions if we've got a few. Must be someone out there's got a question. Hand up down the back there. Dan Parkin.
Thank you. You could well have been talking about South Australia. I mean, we could send someone over there and say exactly the same things, but you did it very well. I'm intrigued by two things. I presume your state government, like ours, has unfunded liabilities. We don't in local government. And two, you have explored amalgamations, as you said. Have any actually taken place, and how would you summarise the outcome?
Sorry, could you say that second part again?
You were saying you have explored amalgamations over the last few years. Have any actually taken place, and could you give a summary of the outcome?
Yeah, sure. Yes, there have been a couple of amalgamations that have occurred. And let's understand, this process has been rolling for at least 7 years. And from a state government perspective, we ran a process of what we call systemic sustainability prior to the state government embarking on a program which was prompted out of our efforts. But over that recent time frame, I think there's been two rural amalgamations take place. City of Greater Geraldton was formed, and the new Shire of Northern, I think, was formed. I can't think off the top of the head of another example. There might be one or two others. Certainly there's been no successful rollout of a sector-wide process. The most recent state process was targeted at the metropolitan area. It came close, but as I say, the community reacted, not so much the local governments, the actual community reacted. And in our legislation, there's a thing that's affectionately known as the day-door provisions, in honour of the state MP that initiated it, which requires at some point in the amalgamation proposal to enable the community to be polled. And if the community poll is successful within certain parameters, the minister's actually prevented from progressing an amalgamation, and that's what happened in a number of cases in metropolitan Perth. And then when the wave of numbers got such that it was clear that the majority, or certainly a substantial number of those amalgamations would proceed, the government stepped back from the entire program. It doesn't mean that it's off the agenda. And I think there is still likely to be at some point in the future a reference to further look at the structure of local government in our sector. I don't say for a minute that it's not necessary. It's about the process that's embarked on when you go about it. It's about the objectives that you have when you set it up. And it's about the integrity with which you operate it while it's rolling out, that I think is the predominant issues. And all of those aspects have been lacking in our previous experiences, certainly from the sector's perspective. Does that help?
Any other questions? Can't see any hands up. Okay. Thanks very much, Wayne. Really appreciate it. Can we give Wayne a